All right, well, welcome to the third class on science, prophecy, and the Bible. Hope you all had a really good week. It's been usual, pretty challenging for me, but we're all here to study God's Word and study His creation, and that's always a fun part for me for sure, and getting my week more focused on the Lord. So, um, I guess one quick announcement I do have the videos from the previous classes. I've managed to get those recorded and uploaded onto YouTube. So, and I'll probably try to do that each week. So, if you miss a class or just want to point somebody to go and look at the class, then you'll be able to do that. And I'm hoping to, record each class. So, you can do a search on science, prophecy, and the Bible, and you'll eventually find it. You'll see the icon of my little title slide, but I'll send out a link that you can go directly to it once I get this class recorded and ready for it. So look for that in the next day or so to see that link to YouTube. But okay, I guess we'll get right into it. We had a little bit left over from last week. We didn't quite finish all the uh, creation versus evolution side of things. So I guess one of the things we left off on was we talked about this a little bit already, so we won't belabor it too much, but just, what's so bad about evolution? Of course, God's character is maligned. If he says it's very good at the end of that creation week, and yet if evolution was true, then, all these prehistoric animals, they were killing each other, eating each other. There's been evidence of disease in the bone and all that kind of stuff. That doesn't seem like a very good creation if that was the case. And one of the key things, and a lot of people don't think about this, is that Jesus' death would not be able to pay for our sin. The whole point of the gospel is Adam sinned and therefore brought death because of sin, and then that caused Jesus to be able to, or to have to come to earth as a man and pay for our sin. But if evolution was true, then death was in the world way before Adam sinned, and so therefore death is not the cause of sin. So then Jesus' death doesn't really mean anything. So it just trying to mix evolution along with Christianity just doesn't work. We broached this last week about eugenics. That was really kind of a sad chapter in the life of the world and even the United States. The United States was kind of even a forefront person or nation for this eugenics, and this is just the self-direction of human evolution. There's all kinds of forced sterilizations, all the way up even to 1981, not that far ago. And people believed in evolution so much so that they thought, well, if you're got some kind of disability, mental retardation or something like that, then you're not allowed to marry and have children, and you'd be sterilized. But on the other hand, if you're smart and athletic and whatever properties they all next human being should have, then okay, you're allowed to marry and allowed to propagate the human race. Very very unchristian type philosophy. And of course, World War II with Hitler, he was very big into this, and that was one of his main reasons behind the Jews. The Nazis were the master race, and the Jews were at the bottom of the rung, and so they needed to be exterminated. And that's exactly what they set out to do. But that was all part of eugenics, even very recently. And we saw this little video on last time, so we won't do that again. Um, but also slavery, that at least shares part of the blame as far as using evolution as a reason for that. If you think those in other parts of the world are somehow lesser humans or something, then you somehow deaden your conscience to slavery. And we saw these even in very fairly recent times. Cincinnati Zoo, Bronx Zoo, Brussels World Fair, 1958. They had these, African villages within these zoos where they basically caged people. Um, and the scientists of the day, they didn't condemn these exhibits. They took the opportunity to study these peoples, and very much, wrong in what they did not that long ago. And in particular, this poor fellow here, he was a pygmy that was captured in the Congo, um, and he uh, was brought to the United States in 1904 and was in the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. And they put him in this monkey cage, and trying to say that, well, he was somehow lesser human, that he was somehow evolved from the monkeys and that kind of thing. And of course, he was nothing further from truth. He was very much human, and he hated this being the object of this curiosity. And finally, they were able to get him out. It was actually a theological seminary that tried to help him and got him free from some of that. But he was just so homesick, and he realized how far away he was from home. And eventually, he found a revolver and then shot himself and killed himself. So kind of a sad state, but all this has roots within the evolutionary thought process. And of course, there's misguided steps in medicine. We've probably all heard of these vestigial organs that we might have, like tonsils or appendix. The medical community may say, well, these are just holdovers from evolution. They never, it was just something that doesn't work. It's just, leftovers. And a lot of times they would cut them out without too much thought. And you can certainly live without your tonsils or your appendix, but they definitely have been seen to serve a purpose. Tonsils, they play a role in immunity from diseases. An appendix, they generate good bacteria in your body. So there's nothing about our bodies that are vestigial, left over from evolution. If there's anything in your body that shouldn't be there, it's because we're devolving, not evolving. So um, that's definitely something that's needs to be rethought. And then, of course, embryonic stem cell research. It's very controversial, but the Word of God is very true and very clear. Psalm 139 says, "For you created my inmost being, and you knit me together in my mother's womb." So to take these embryos and do research and things like that, that's in God's view, that would be murder. So it's definitely not um, something to be taken lightly. And this evolutionary type thoughts are just that we're nothing more than animals, and that nothing is really all that morally wrong about doing those kind of researches. And then also another controversial subject, man-made global warming. For the most part, that's driven by greed and politics. And there's certainly people with well-meaning thoughts about that and want to preserve the world. And God certainly wants us to take care of the world that He's allowed us to live in. But you just see so much greed associated with this, and we'll talk about this here in just a second. But the whole concept of man affecting the climate of the world is really um, even just logically doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, because we're so small compared to the entire world. I mean, it's almost like dropping a few grains of salt in a swimming pool, and that's just not going to affect the saltiness of the swimming pool. And we'll see here in just a second that the sun by far has much greater influence on our weather and things like that. So I'll look at that here in just a minute. And of course, just countless wasted hours of time and resources researching in the wrong direction. So about global warming, premise is that because of technology advances and causes of air pollution, the CO2 and methane gases that man has generated has caused the Earth to warm up. When I was a kid, I think I was probably in the 7th or 8th grade. They scared us to death, saying there's going to be an ice age in 25 years. So the concept that the Earth is always been warming ever since man has been around is just not true. The cycle of warming and cooling of the Earth has been well documented, and I have no doubt that the Earth may be warming. We're in a warming cycle, but that man caused it is the big doubt. It's been directly correlated that sunspot activity, the storms on the sun, are directly cause weather problems on the Earth. One of the lowest sunspot activities ever recorded is Maunder minimum, resulted in what was called the Little Ice Age, where the Thames River in England that totally froze over back in the 16, 1700s. So the Earth goes through periods of cold and warm areas, but God's still in control, and man is not, is the main point. And just another evidence here, that's that plot there, you see the upper top left, the blue is the temperature and red is the CO2 concentration. And you can see that temperature rises and then the CO2 rises. It's not the other way around. It's not that carbon dioxide rises and then the temperature rises, which would be the case if it was man-made global warming. So there's a lot of evidence that shows that man just does not affect uh, weather and temperature at least to the degree. There's always little pockets of that, but to the degree that the whole Earth is going to warm up because of mankind is just not scientifically plausible. Another thing is animal rights. You don't usually hear about that too much, but there are some movements out there. This Animal Liberation Front. They've had over 600 criminal acts since the 1990s, arsons, bombings, and theft. If you think that we all evolved and we're all just animals here on the earth, then what right does a human have over, the little snail darter that's in your neighborhood, or another, dolphin or whatever? We certainly should take care of the animals that God has placed on this earth with us. But God said that we're going to rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the air and the livestock and the wild animals. It doesn't mean we abuse them, for sure. We should take care of them, but to have them have rights the same as a human being is just not right. And then, of course, lastly, it just endangers Christian faith. It makes one question God's word. It's certainly okay to investigate and to check out for yourself, but to me, it's never appropriate to assume God's word is wrong just because science says so. Because scientists are human beings. They've got their own agenda, um, or they may just have wrong assumptions. They may be perfectly naive in what they're doing and have no bias, which is almost impossible to have. But even if they didn't have a bias, it's very difficult to have the correct assumptions when you're looking back in such long ages as they would be. Your worldview really affects your beliefs. And here in Mark chapter 7, it says, "All too well you reject the commandment of God, that you may keep your traditions. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and your mother, and he who curses his father or mother, let him be put to death.' But you say, if a man says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have been received from me is Corban, that is, a gift to God, then you no longer let him do anything for his father or his mother, making the word of God of no effect through your traditions, which you have handed down. And many such things you do." And Colossians says, "But beware lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the tradition of men, according to the basic principles of the world, and not according to Christ. For in him dwells all the fullness of the Godhead bodily, and you are complete in him, who is the head of all principality and power." So Jesus is saying here that our traditions, at least the ones that violate God's word, can cause us to be ineffective in our Christian life. So we have to just be very careful about believing the news media or believing the science media, those kind of things. If it's contrary to God's word, then they're wrong. We'll know if ands or buts about that. And so, in conclusion, about this section, creationism and evolution, they both require faith. Of course, we have to have a faith in creationism that God did create the world and the universe in exactly the way He did it. In 6 days. There is, definitely a measure of faith of that, but there's also a faith, and to me, far, far, far greater faith to believe in evolution, that somehow natural processes form the world. And they also have to have this faith in a hopeful monster, as it's called, that this transition creature will one day be found. And as we discussed, there's never been a single transition fossil that's ever been found. There's never been a fossil that's in between an ape and a man, or some other, reptile to mammal. They haven't found any of it ever. And so it would require a huge amount of faith to believe that, in my opinion. So just in a review of this section, Genesis not only tells us how long it took God to create the universe, it also provides information for us to know how long we have been here through the ages of patriarchs. We looked at that last week, where you can uh, sum up the ages of how long the patriarchs lived and correlate that back to our current day, and we see that it's approximately 6,000 years or so. False assumptions and bad scientific methodologies kind of plague the evolutionary theory in various areas of science. Much of the evil we have seen down through the history had a foundation in the belief of evolution. So very much um, not something that we need to uh, believe in for sure as a Christian. All right, so now let's switch gears to cosmology. And of course, this is the science of the origin and development of the universe. So just some main points for this particular section. So the heavens tell us that they were designed by a creator, and not only designed, but it seems finely tuned for life. Sometimes it's referred to as the anthropic principle. We'll look at that in more detail. But yes, the universe is very finely tuned for life. And also that the Earth is positioned in our galaxy to allow us to explore. And then lastly, we'll look at how our solar system defies how evolution works. And remember, the evolution, it all came from Charles Darwin, who applied it to the way animals. He observed how animals evolved, or thought he did anyway. But it's been applied to all these areas of science, and so it's just way beyond what Darwin had ever even envisioned his theories to come about. So here's this picture from the Hubble Space Telescope. We saw this a couple classes ago, I think. Um, and this picture shows all these galaxies, all those dots and smudges you see in that picture are galaxies, probably close to 10,000 galaxies there. And of course, each galaxy has hundreds of millions of stars in them. So it's very much a dense universe of a lot of created things. And this aperture of this picture is only about the size of the full moon in the sky. So you can imagine multiplying that by uh, whatever, how many full moons in the sky you could fit, and that's how many galaxies that there is. So it's pretty amazing, and pretty amazing that scientists could think that that happened by chance. And we read in Psalm 19, it says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the earth of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech, and night after night they display knowledge." It's interesting. If you were at Cross Point a few years ago when we moved into our new building, Pastor John allowed us to write scriptures on the unfinished walls there on the platform of the stage there. If you had a verse that you liked or whatever, you could write on the walls before they closed up everything, before they finished it all up. And this was actually the verse that I wrote on the walls that's in there. So it's just kind of a neat thing that we did. But I always like to remember that that's the verse I wrote. But it says that the heavens declare the glory of God, and that it proclaims the work of his hands. And so what speech and knowledge are the heavens telling us? What is it talking about there? It's saying that the heavens tell us that they were created and designed by a creator. In Romans 1:20, we see it there. It says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." So we're without excuse because God has made it so obvious from creation that he exists, and that he allows us no excuse not to believe. That's why I personally believe even those that may be in the deepest, darkest jungles of the world, maybe they've never heard of Jesus, but they certainly can look up in the sky and see some pretty amazing things. And so to me, they know that there has to be a creator, just from that aspect alone. And it's interesting, it's like God on purpose made his creation timeline opposite of mankind. If you remember in Genesis 1, it talked about, the first day was light in the beginning, and energy. He said, let there be light. And the second day was sky and water, and the third land and seas. And on the fourth day was the sun, moon, and stars. And then, of course, the fish and birds, and then mankind, and then he rested. But then evolution would say that the stars, sun, and moon were created first, and then the rest of it. But it's not definitely in the same order as creationism. And really, in that vein, you look at down through the ages of prehistoric societies, including the Egyptians. Worship of the sun and objects in the sky was pretty prevalent. And of course, the Egyptians, the sun god Ra was one of their biggest gods that they had, and that most likely affected the Hebrews. They lived with them for 400 years, and everybody around them was worshiping the sun. So you would think that they would be tempted at least to do that as well. But of course, we read in Job, who is one of the oldest books of the Bible, that says, if I have regarded the sun and its radiance, or the moon moving in splendor, so that my heart was secretly enticed, and my hand offered them a kiss of homage, then these also would be sins to be judged, for I would have been unfaithful to God on high. So God is definitely saying that sun worship and creation worship is definitely wrong, and we're supposed to worship the Creator, not the creation. This is just kind of a little bit subjective, but it's interesting. In Hebrews 11, it talks about how the worlds were framed with unseen things. And that word framed is this Greek word katarizo, and it's meaning to mend what has been broken, to repair or to put in order. And you see that same Greek word in Matthew, when it talks about James and John were mending their nets. So it's like the worlds were formed by this, or in putting order with this net. They're mending the nets by creating the worlds, but at the same time, it's the same word used in mending the physical fish nets. And of course, dark energy and dark matter, those are things we can't see. We only see about 5% of the universe. There's about 95% of the universe that we can't even see. And science thinks that they call it dark matter and dark energy because they can see influences on all the celestial objects. The little blue smudges you see in that image are galaxies, and these red threads that you see that look like a net are what we think are the influences from dark energy and dark matter. So it looks like this connecting fabric of the universe. Looks much like a net, just like it talked about how the worlds were framed with this net-like substance, as dark energy, dark matter. This anthropic principle, this is really getting more popular as time goes on. And this is the observation that the universe seems finely tuned for life and exploration. It doesn't mean that the science is coming around to Christianity, but there's so much evidence that just shows that the universe had to be designed by somebody. They don't know what, maybe aliens or something, but just leaving it to pure chance, even the strongest evolutionists are coming to the conclusion that it just couldn't have happened. So they're leaning to this intelligent design theory, and that's part of this anthropic principle. And it's kind of neat too, you can see in that little picture, it shows you are here, and notice that we're in between the spiral arms of our galaxy. If you ever go out to a very dark place outside and at night, you can actually see, what's called the Milky Way, and that's one of those spiral arms you're seeing in the sky. You have to be really dark skies to see it, but that's just a cluster of stars and dust and things like that are in our galaxy. But we're strategically placed in between these spiral arms so that we can actually view the rest of the universe. If we were actually inside one of these spiral arms, even if we would survive fine, but it would be so cloudy in the night sky that we wouldn't be able to really see much out into the universe. So it's like God not only tuned the universe for life, but also tuned things for us to be able to explore and visibly see things. And these are just some of the uh, parameters, the factors that are tuned on a razor's edge, really. And there's a lot more. There's dozens of these factors. But if Earth were 5% closer to the sun, water would boil. If Earth were 1% further away, it would freeze. The atmosphere, if you have too much of it, you get a greenhouse, but not enough, then cosmic radiation would destroy life. Earth's reflectivity, too much in the Earth would freeze, too little, another greenhouse effect. Even the color of the sun, if it were redder or bluer, photosynthesis would be impeded. And you have a bunch of other anthropic principles, the electron-proton mass ratio, the oxygen-nitrogen ratio, ozone levels, maturity of our sun. I mean, just many, many more. And that's why scientists are going to this intelligent design theory, just because it just looks like we've been tuned for that. And it's very interesting. A few years ago, there was a full solar eclipse just up the road from Huntsville here. We went up to Smithville in Tennessee to actually see the full solar eclipse. And I tell you, it was almost like a spiritual event right there. I mean, that was pretty amazing to see how the moon exactly covered up the sun just in a few minutes like that. And if you think about it, if this was all just random chance and there was no designer, how in the world would a moon with its size and the sun with its size almost exactly lay on top of each other and block totally the light of the sun? That just, I mean, the chances of that happening by just pure statistics is, that's mind-boggling right there. So um, let me look at this real quick. This is just some math here, but just to show how this is happening, you can see uh, this is the configuration of a solar eclipse where you have, the sun is 93 million miles away with a radius of 432,000 miles, and the moon is only 239,000 miles away, and it has a radius of 1,080 miles. And so you can compute, just using some simple trigonometry there, what the angular distance is. And for the moon, for somebody on the Earth, it's 0.5178 degrees. And for the sun, it's 0.532 degrees. And so you can see that the moon is just slightly smaller. And even that is kind of neat because it's as a design, because it allows you to see the solar flares and things like that as the moon is in place of the, or over the place of the sun. You can see the actual corona and those solar flares coming out from it. So it's just like in every way, this planet we live on was designed, and this universe was designed for us. And switching gears just a little bit, we talked about quantum mechanics and things like that a little while ago. Um, this may not be a lot known, but there's the biggest machine that's ever been built is there under the border of Switzerland and France, and it's called the Large Hadron Collider. It's a pretty amazing facility. Of course, I've never been there, but it'd be fascinating to go. You can see in the upper right-hand corner, there's a guy there in the middle of that picture, and how big that part of the collider is. But basically, what it does is it takes two proton beams um, and gets them going in this 17-mile circumference tube, and one beam going one way, one beam going the other. And it may take them weeks or even months to get them up to speed. They go to near close to light speed at 186,000 miles per second. And then they slam them into each other, and it breaks the protons apart into a bunch of subatomic particles. And this Higgs boson particle, sometimes called the God particle, that's what they were searching for. Theoretically, they thought it existed, and they finally found it there in 2012. And this particle is what gives mass to matter. Before that, they didn't really know how matter even had mass, but this particle somehow shows them that this is the particle that gives mass to what we see around us. And in particular, it said that it would have 125 giga electron volts of mass for this particle. And they were excited but disappointed at the same time when they found this, because what they were hoping for is that it would have more mass than that. I don't understand the physics, but apparently, if it had had more mass, then it would lead to credence to the existence of a multiverse. That our universe is just one of millions, or if not infinite, other universes. And the thinking behind that is that if we're just one of millions, or if not infinite, other universes, we just happen to live in the universe that has a tuning of for life, and these other universes would not. And so it kind of gets around uh, this finely tuned universe that we live in. So it shows again, long ages and a lot of time and statistical probabilities and all. And something could just be tuned just by accident if you have an infinite number of universes. But apparently they didn't find the mass that they wanted, and therefore they're kind of back to square one in the universe as far as that goes. And we also see that God describes his creation very accurately. The Bible is a pretty old book. It was a lot of it was written, Job, 4,000 years ago, and even some of the Psalms, several thousand years ago. Um, and we see other cultures really describing the creation and universe around them, not so much, not as near as accurate. Um, we also see in the Psalm here that God calls each of the stars, calls them by name. So it really shows that he treats his creation very, very specially. He really, and if he's going to call each star by name, he's certainly going to know the names of his people that he's made in his image. And it's interesting in Psalm 19, it talks about the sun rising at one end of the heavens and making its circuit to the other. Nothing is deprived of its warmth. And that Hebrew word for circuit means revolution. And that's the exact description we use today for orbital motion. David wrote this song 1000 BC, so 3,000 years ago. Uh, it already was in the scriptures of how things moved in the universe. But yet the ancient Greeks, shown here with Atlas here showing up, holding up the world, and the Greeks were known to be the smart people of the world at that time. The Hindus believed that the Earth sat on the back of elephants, which were standing on the back of a big turtle, and they believed that all the way up to the 1800s. Job, that was written in 2000 BC, and says that he spreads out the northern skies over empty space and he suspends the earth over nothing. I mean, those are pretty amazing things. Not a lot of detail in the scripture, but it's certainly not untrue. And yet, all these other cultures, very easily disprovable theories that they had. One of the most often asked questions about creation is why can we see stars that are millions of light years away if the Earth is only 6,000 years old? And that's a really good question. But light travels about 6 trillion miles in 1 year, and that's known as the light year. So if we can see galaxies that are alleged to be 5 or 15, whatever billion light years away, that means the universe is at least 5 billion years old. Just to put this in perspective, the sun, it takes about 8 minutes for light to reach us from the sun. So the sun could explode and you wouldn't know about it for 8 minutes. So that's how far away the sun is. But these other galaxies, they're so far away, it takes billions of years, or at least according to evolutionary theory, for that light to get here. So if it's really that far away, how can we see it if the universe is only 6,000 years old? So there's a number of different questions or solutions about that. Number one, God created a mature universe. Of course, Adam, he was created. He wasn't created an embryo or a little baby or something. He was a grown man. And of course, he would have needed trees and plants with mature fruit to survive. So God simply created a universe that was already mature. And that can kind of be inferred from Genesis 1, when God created the plants and animals and not seeds and embryos. And I guess the key note with that is that just because something's mature does not imply age. Adam, he would, I don't know how old he was at creation, but he may have been 20 years in maturity, but he was still only a few days old. So maturity and age are not the same thing. And really, if God purposefully created things to look old, then and they weren't, then that would mean like He's deceiving us. So I don't think that's the case at all. One of the things to keep in mind is that there's definitely inaccurate distance calculations amongst the scientific field. It's very difficult to measure distances in space accurately. They talk about these places being 5 billion light years or however how many, like it's just a fact and like they know for sure, but they don't know at all for sure. Um, about the best they can do is about 400 light years. That's all, just 400 light years that they know is pretty accurate. Anything further than that is very suspect. And it's kind of interesting. You can use this method called triangulation and using parallax. Um, and you can actually do it yourself, this methodology where if you hold your finger out towards some object in your house or distance away and close one eye and look at where your finger is measured from whatever object in the distance is, and then close that eye and open the other eye, and you'll see that your finger moves relative to that stationary spot that you're looking at in the distance. And if you know those distances that you look like your finger apparently moved from that object, and you know how the distance between your two eyeballs, then you can use some trigonometry there, and you can actually calculate what the distance is of that object. And that's basically what they're doing here. They're allowing the Earth to go to one side of the sun and see where this object is relative to a stationary star background, and then allowing the Earth to go the other side of the sun and looking at that same object and doing some trig, and they can figure out exactly how far it is away, up to 400 light years. But that's all that they can do. One other reason is light may not take a direct route. Um, we'll normally think of light traveling in a straight path, or what's called Euclidean path, but there's also something called Riemannian, which is a curved path, and they've observed light traveling in this curved path, as I say there, in 27 binary star systems that have that behavior. So you can imagine if you have, like a ball, for example, if you assume the universe is a sphere. So if light that we see from long distances away are actually traveling on a curved surface on the rim of that ball, or on the rim of the universe, versus just actual straight line to that object that we see, it's going to look a lot further away than what it really is. And if we look at this equation here, that's just another little trig equation, but that's how they calculate the distance, this Riemannian distance versus straight line distance. And so you can see if it's fairly short, 1 year, 1 light year distance, it's almost 1 light year from the Riemannian curved distance. But as you go up, 4 light years, 3.81, 30 light years, 12.5. But then you get out to infinite or almost infinite, and it just kind of plateaus at 15.7 light years. So this curved space, if light really traveled that way, then it's showing that even those distant galaxies really aren't 14 billion light years away. It just looks that way because the light is curved. And also, even if there's not a curvature like this Riemannian space we just talked about, we know for a fact that light is influenced by gravity and probably by this dark matter and dark energy. This little picture I've got here shows a simulation of the dark matter and dark energy, and viewing an object. These little blue dots are different galaxies, and how light might travel through this dark matter and dark energy. And you can see it doesn't travel a straight line. There's a lot of zigzags in there of the light traveling due to the influences of gravity, and as well as the dark matter and dark energy. So it'll make it look further away than it actually is. Another reason we might can see things further away, and with it only being 6,000 years, because the speed of light may be slowing down. Um, Certainly, there's been experiments even going back to 1675, where the first light speed experiment was done. They thought at that time light was just infinite, but ever since then they've made a number of different methods, 16 different methods with over 50 different types of instruments and methodologies for looking at the speed of light, and all of them show this decay trend. And statistically, it shows that there's a 99.46% confidence level that in the past that the speed of light was faster than it is today. And some might say that, well, that was because the instruments weren't as good back then as they are now. But they've taken into that account the errors that were in those instruments, decades ago. Don't have enough error to account for the decay that we see in the speed of light. So, and of course, we're just measuring for a few hundred years ago. There's no telling what it might have been, a few thousand years ago, and certainly at the beginning of the universe. So when I think probably light was at infinite or near infinite speed. And of course, there's always the possibility of these relativistic effects during the first day of creation. This is kind of a famous little problem here, the so-called twin paradox. Um, so this is, you see that little equation there called the time dilation equation. Um, so the V is the speed that you're traveling, and C is the speed of light. And then the time and space would be the time that you're traveling at that speed. And then the time of the Earth is the time that you would be stationary sitting on the Earth. So the problem goes that if you had two twin boys that were identical in age, of course, and one decides to go to Alpha Centauri, which is our closest star to us, and that's 4.3 light years away. So if he travels 4.3 light years and then travels back and visits back with his twin brother that was just sat on the Earth the whole time, that time changes and is different for the boys. Um, the one twin goes into space, comes back. For him, only 8.6 light years, or excuse me, 8.6 years have changed. So he's only 8.6 years older. But the twin that stayed on the Earth, 61 years have passed. I mean, it all seems very difficult to understand, but that's a very provable uh, um, equation, and is used quite a bit in science today. So it's interesting that some of those kind of effects may have occurred when you have these high velocity events that may have happened during the creation week. And this is kind of an interesting thing too, that there's actually a real world twin paradox. Astronaut Scott Kelly, he commanded the International Space Station for 340 days. He ended his mission on March 1st of 2016, but he had an identical brother twin, Mark, that was, of course, stayed on the Earth. And because of Scott's time aboard the ISS, he's approximately 14 milliseconds younger than he was before the mission relative to his twin brother. So just kind of an interesting thing. And for me personally, I believe that this is probably more uh, the reason why you can see things so far away. We read in Genesis 1, God said, "Let there be light," and we discussed that really that word can mean energy. Light is just a part of the spectrum of energy. And we read in Psalm, God wraps himself in light as with a garment, and he stretches out the heavens like a tent. So when he said, "Let there be light," to me, that's saying, "Let there be energy." And we can look at Einstein's famous equation. We've probably all seen this, that E equals mc squared. E is energy, and m is mass, and c is the speed of light. Well, if you solve for that little equation for the speed of light, and you have infinite or near infinite energy, or you're going to have infinite or near infinite speed of light. So all these things are, if God is, you would arguably say that he's definitely uh, can exhibit near infinite energy. So when he's creating during that creation week, the speed of light, even though there may be some object that's, even if it is a billion light years away, that light is instantaneously incident on all parts of the universe because of the infinite speed of light from that. So that's just my philosophy on that. Um, but there's a number of ways that we could see those long distances. Then this next part, our own solar system defies evolution. We have this principle called angular momentum. And angular momentum is just a measure of the tendency of an object to rotate. And it's calculated by just taking the mass times the velocity times whatever the radius of the rotation is. We'll be looking related to that on something called the nebular hypothesis. And the nebular hypothesis says that at some point in the past, there was this big rotating gas cloud. And within that gas cloud, somehow mass and matter coalesced into something and just kind of flung off planets within our solar system. So you might see Venus and then Earth, Jupiter, and the rest of what we see in the solar system. But the problem with a lot of that is, number one, the composition of the planets are nothing like the sun. Like if this was a spinning mass for the sun that spun us out, the rotation of the planets are too fast, and the rotation direction of our moons don't follow the angular momentum principle as well. So, for example, our sun rotates every 25 days. So it takes almost a month for our sun to make one rotation. As opposed to the Earth, it rotates every 24 hours. So how could the Earth be spun off and rotate so fast when the sun only rotates a factor of 25 times less than the Earth? That would be akin to having a ball on a string and just barely keeping it in the air with a very slow rotation, and then the ball shoots out from the sling at 100 miles an hour. It just doesn't make any sense. It violates this angular momentum principle. And then not only that, all planets don't orbit in the same direction, or excuse me, they do orbit in the same direction, but they don't rotate in the same direction. The Earth rotates west to east, Venus rotates east to west, Uranus rotates north to south. And then various moons in our solar system. If the moons of our planets were somehow spun off from their parent planet, you would think it would have to rotate in orbit in the same direction of the rotation of the planet, but they don't. They have what's called retrograde orbits. And you can see in that little table there that a lot of the planets do have retrograde orbits. And it's key to part of that too is that part of the table, the third column says eccentricity. That's the measure of how circular an orbit is. And those are very circular orbits there of these moons. Because one of the theories is that, well, if it didn't spin off from a planet, then the moon was just captured as it was kind of floating through our solar system. But if that was the case, then you'd have highly elliptical orbits. They would not be circular the way they are. So it's just not very plausible that there could be just by chance the way these moons and planets are acting. There's also, evolutionists call this the lunar crisis. The moon is drifting away from the Earth at a rate of 1.5 inches per year. And of course, it would have even drifted faster in times past. And the evolutionary theory says, well, the moon is 4.5 billion years old. Well, if it's drifting away from us at that time, at that speed, 1.5 inches per year, then in the past, it would have had to have been closer to the Earth. And if you go back 4.5 billion years, well, there's no way it would have been broken up by tidal forces only 1.4 billion years ago, due to as soon as it got close enough to the Earth, and the Earth's gravity would have just cracked it up. So with only 1.4 billion years, even though that's a long time frame, that's still nowhere near long enough for all the evolutionary processes to have happened. So 6,000 years ago, the moon would only have been 800 feet closer. So I mentioned a while ago that evolutionists give two reasons of how the moon exists. Number one, it may have been just free floating in space and then happened to be captured by Earth's gravity, or a massive collision with the Earth, by some asteroid or something like that, caused the moon to break off and begin orbiting the Earth. But the problem is either scenario would have produced a much more elliptical orbit than the nearly circular orbit of the moon. If either of those happened, it would be far more circular, or far more elliptical in its orbit. So evolutionary theory is just not supported. And the Earth's spin rate, the Earth is slowing down at a rate of 2 milliseconds every century due to lunar and tidal forces. So if the Earth were really 4.5 billion years old, the initial spin rate would have to be significantly higher than it is now. So could it have been rotating faster in the past? The gravitational forces from the sun and moon are constantly pulling at the Earth, affecting a slowdown in the Earth's rotation. So it had to have rotated faster in the past, but how fast? So this is just a fairly simple physics equation here that the centripetal acceleration that we experience standing on the Earth can be computed by the radius of the Earth times the rotation rate of the Earth squared. So if you just take that into account, and the Earth was really 4.6 billion years old, and that formation in the Earth's rotation rate would have to have been 2 times faster, so a 12-hour day. And that would amount to gravity we would feel would be reduced by a factor of 4. So if you weighed 200 pounds, you'd only weigh 50 pounds back then, 4.6 billion years ago, if the Earth was really rotating that fast. Of course, it doesn't seem like all that much, only twice as fast, but weather would be drastically changed. The sun doesn't have a chance to warm up all the parts of the Earth if it's going so fast. So most likely we'd have a lot cooler Earth, winds, atmospheric turbulence would probably all be affected. And just a note there, if the Earth were 17 times faster, that was at the point when we would overcome gravity and would be flung off the Earth. Just kind of a little interesting tidbit there. And it's interesting, Apollo 11, before they landed on the moon, they were very concerned that when Apollo 11 landed on the moon, that they would just sink into miles of dust. They thought that, well, if the moon is really 4.5 billion years old, and they know that ultraviolet light from the sun reduces exposed rock and reduces it to dust at the rate of 3 or 4 10,000ths of an inch per year. So it's not that fast, but if you got that amount of time, then you're going to have a whole lot of dust. And so they thought that there might be miles, literally miles of dust on the moon, and the Apollo 11, when it landed, would just sink down into it. But when you look at creation theory and assume that the moon is 6,000 years old, there's only 2 inches of dust when they actually landed and checked it out. There was only 2 inches of dust, and that confirmed the creation theory. Another fact, comets are prevalent in our solar system. They orbit the sun and are eroded by the sun with each pass. You notice my little graphic there. We typically like to, we see things flying in the air, and we see, a kite or an airplane with a sign behind it as it flies, and the tail of that sign is always behind the object flying in the sky, and that's just because of the wind resistance and all that. But when a comet goes through our universe or goes through our solar system, the solar radiation from the sun is what's causing the tail of the comet. So that solar radiation emanating from the sun is what causes the tail of the comet. So it's just the tail is gonna go in the direction of that solar radiation. So it doesn't really go in the direction of the comet like we might like to think. But in any case, that tail is is showing the erosion of that comet as it goes past the sun. So if the solar system were really billions of years old, there just would be no more comets in our solar system. They would be have all eroded away through the solar radiation. And this is really a fun video here. This guy is Richard Dawkins, and he's a famous astrophysicist. And this is from the movie Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. Ben Stein, if you know him from Ferris Bueller or some of those movies like that, but he was in this movie. He was the narrator and interviewer of Richard Dawkins. And I want you to pay attention and closely to what Richard Dawkins' answers are to his questions. So you can see, Richard Dawkins definitely had his opinion there. And if you notice what he said at the very last, the Hebrew God of the Bible would be a very unpleasant prospect. So there's very much a bias there that they don't want God to be the answer. They're trying to do everything they can to see that there's something different out there. And it's interesting, this movie, if you ever get a chance to see it, Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed, that's a really good movie. It really shows how, if you believe, especially in the scientific or academic community, if you don't believe in evolution, then you could actually be fired or certainly ostracized. And this movie kind of goes on to show people that even believing in the intelligent design theory, people were ostracized and not allowed to be promoted and things like that. So very much a bias in the industry. And of course, the reason why they don't want there to be God as the answer is because it makes man accountable to God for their sin. That's why it would be a very unpleasant prospect, as Richard Dawkins said. Okay, so let's just get a quick review here. It says that God created the heavens with such design that he gives mankind no excuse for not believing he created it. Dozens of physical properties of the universe seem finely tuned for life, so much so that even some secular scientists have adopted the intelligent design theory. So God has placed the earth in a location that allows us to observe much of the universe. Very much a neat thing here as far as the cosmology and how God has shown us so much that he's designed things that he gives us no excuse not to believe, really. So I think that's just one area of science. This is just one that we're going to be looking at a number of. Next week we're going to be looking at geology, and that's a really big one there. A lot of folks see the Grand Canyon and think, okay, well, look at how the Colorado River formed this canyon over millions of years, and all these striated layers, and how that makes shows long Earth ages. But what they don't take into account is the catastrophic events that happened, and namely Noah's flood. So we're going to be looking at how other events, such as like Mount St. Helens, when it exploded, and all those catastrophic events related to it, carved out canyons that look very much like the Grand Canyon, smaller scale for sure, but still canyons that were formed in weeks. I hope you can turn in next week, and we'll be looking at the geology section. I think that's about all I had. Hope we can turn in next week. Like I said, we'll be going over the geology section. And if you have any questions, again, just feel free to email me, and be glad to try to answer any of those kind of questions. But otherwise, we'll see you next week.